Welcome back to another Q&A episode, which as always is audio only, so this works kind of like a podcast. So there's no reason to look at the screen here. You can go ahead and work on your guitars or sharpen your chisels or whatever you need to do. So all of the questions that I'll be answering today have to do with bracing. I didn't plan it this way, but it's actually kind of cool that the theme of this Q&A will simply be the very deep topics surrounding bracing patterns and tap tuning. Now, anything I say here you should always take with a grain of salt, because when it comes to these topics that are very deep physics-based topics that even ultimately have more of an understanding based in the intuitions of many builders standing on the shoulders of builders before them, our best understandings are based in that realm more so than in the hyper-rational, physics-based realm where we're only beginning to crack the code and understand truly how acoustics work. My own understanding of the acoustics of the system that is called a acoustic guitar is constantly evolving, and I don't anticipate any point in my life where I will be able to say that I fully grasp these concepts. That's my disclaimer. It's a lifelong learning process, and I hope you'll enjoy that learning process. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into some of these questions. Okay, so this question comes from Matthew in the members forum, and Matthew writes, I am building my first OM guitar. Tradition indicates that one should notch the sides and allow the ends of the top X braces to be securely glued to the sides. Is it absolutely necessary to connect the X braces to the sides, or is it permissible to allow the X braces to float, allowing the top to resonate more freely? Has anyone tried this approach before? Will it compromise the top if I taper the ends of the X braces to just short of joining the sides? So basically what he's talking about is feathering the X braces like you would feather other braces, like the tone bars and the finger braces. Now I'm going to come at this from two different angles here. One, first of all, I just want to say that you mentioned that this is your first guitar. Well, you said first OM guitar, but I'm assuming you mean it's your first guitar, period. If I'm incorrect, let me know if you built a different type of a dreadnought or something like that in the past. But either way, really, I don't think you should be messing with, on your first instrument or even your first couple instruments, there's no good reason to really mess with the bracing patterns that are already out there. Because if you do that, you really have no basis for comparison if you've made no other guitars before using the traditional patterns. It takes a lot of, it just takes years and iterations of building guitars to even start to understand the purpose of the patterns. And yes, you can read about them, and I can answer this question here, but there's a certain amount of intuitive know-how that just comes from actually building them. And before you've developed that, if you get a little too hasty right away and want to start changing things with the bracing right at the outset, you're going to end up, I think, walking backwards. Again, without that basis for understanding the why of what you're doing, which is often very, very complicated and a lot more complicated than it initially seems, what I think you'll end up doing is you're much more likely to have a negative result than a positive one if you're just sort of groping around in the dark and making adjustments based on limited understanding. And now I'll speak a little bit about the actual physics behind doing what you're doing, and also why, if you look around, you don't see many designs that are like this. And if you do see a design that is more or less not connected with the sides, it's because the transverse bar is much lower below the sound hole, like it is on the classical guitar or on Taylor's new V-bracing. And what that does is that creates a smaller footprint for the vibrating portion of the top. And so the fact that it's not stiffly connected in with the sides is sort of made up by the fact that the footprint is shortened, again, by that transverse bar moving down below the X-brace. Or I'm sorry, down below the sound hole. But just on a traditional X brace pattern, if you were to feather those brace ends, with the idea being that less is more and you're taking stiffness out of the top, which yes, you are doing, the fault in that thinking is that less is always more, that removing stiffness is always a good idea. Whereas in reality, by feathering those ends instead of tucking them into the kerfing, into the sides, you are actually making the top not stiff enough. So with a steel string guitar, it's very much about the evenness of stiffness cross board as it is about the overall stiffness of the system. And if you feather those braces, you basically decouple it from the largest and most significant and important brace of the entire instrument, and that is the sides themselves. Massive amount of stiffness is added to the top just by the simple fact that it's connected with these giant, essentially they're like pillars, these foundational pillars of the sides themselves. I often think of them as kind of like just a row of a system of pillars holding up the whole top. I know it's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, or you can think of it as just it's a giant solid wall. And so if you have, imagine like a lattice structure on a warehouse building that you would see holding the warehouse roof up. If that entire structure was just free floating, it would be several orders of magnitude looser and less structural than if it was connected in with the walls of the building itself. Now you asked, would it compromise the structural integrity? Maybe over time, that with the tension of the strings pulling on the top, it might, but it actually might not compromise the structural integrity. It might surprise you that my actual concern here is that the tone will go away. It will sound much worse. You'll lose a lot of sustain and projection and bass response. Well, that's a little bit more complicated. I don't know necessarily you'll lose bass response, but you'll lose a lot of the things you're trying to gain by over loosening the top. And finally, just to reiterate again, when you're starting out in guitar making, a lot of people make this mistake, but I think focusing on the tone and the bracing pattern and everything related to the acoustics of the guitar is kind of like you're just diving a little too deep into the deep end too early. And what you really should be focusing on as a new builder is your fit, meaning your joinery work, how tight your joints are, and the structure of the guitar, and just learning the actual operations to create the various parts of the guitar and to do that well, because that's a major hurdle in and of itself. Tackling the acoustics is a lifelong struggle that you'll be working on, so don't get too hasty with it right off the bat. And the next question comes from Andrew in the members forum. Andrew also took my workshop in spring of 2018. Andrew writes, question on tap tuning. I got to a point where I have what I think is a full spectrum of tones from high to low on the soundboard. I have attached 2 images of how I tapped it out and the locations that went from high to low. One image is 2 patterns, one on the right side of the soundboard and one on the left side, and the other image is tones from 4 locations. Okay, so he's attached an image to the forum post that shows where in the bracing pattern the high and the low notes are. And I love the fact that he's created a map like this. I've never created a map like this, but honestly I think it's a great idea, mostly for the fact of just being able to look back on this as you iterate on the next guitar and the next guitar, and this will basically serve as a template for creating those overtones in the future. Okay, but back to his question now. The question I have is, how do I know if I'm finished? Is there something else I should be listening for? Will the overall tone of the guitar now be shaped by the woods used on the front, back, and sides, or will tuning the soundboard influence that? Okay, so this can be an extremely complicated question, but let me try to cover this as best as I can. First of all, a little bit of background here. So Andrew was in the workshop, and in the workshop we do some tap tuning. We voice the plates before we attach them. And to kind of put it all in a nutshell, there's two main steps to that process. First is just ballparking, or I always call it ballparking, which is getting the soundboard to a sufficient tap tone and flex as far as when you hold the X-brace arms in your hands and just kind of flex that board. There's a feel to it that you can only get from that tactile sense of flexing the board itself, that sort of tells you when you're in a ballpark where you're going to have or you're most likely to have a decent sustain, projection, etc. So that's ballparking. And then what Andrew is talking about here is the second part of this process, which is less critical part, and that may be part of the issue with his question here. The less critical part, which is creating a small variety of tap tones. And when I say small variety, I really mean like 3 or 4 tones with good separation. And you do this simply by removing small amounts of wood from certain braces, and all you're trying to do is create some separation. So, for example, if your tap tone, no matter where you tap, kind of sounds uniformly the same, you're going to remove a little bit of wood to create a nice separation. Generally speaking, I believe the best tones to be looking for are probably those most pleasing to the human ear, which would be a 4th or a 5th interval. If you're getting, for example, like a 2nd, then that's not really enough separation to make it interesting. Another way to look at this whole thing, too, is just to think of it like you're trying to make an attractive sounding drum. If you think of a dull or boring sounding drum, it's going to sound the same no matter where you tap it, whether you tap it sort of near the rim or in the center. It'll never sound exactly the same, but it'll sound, there won't be a large separation between that rim tap and the tap tone at the center. So hopefully that's useful in the way of an analogy, although it's a very limited analogy. Now, Andrew here is asking about the overall tone, so I think, Andrew, you're just putting a little too much stock into this part of the process. This part of the process is not about the overall tone or the fundamental tone. This part of the process is really about just adding a little bit of interesting overtones, and hopefully adding interesting overtones, because honestly, you only have so much control over the process at this point, and your experience with previous instruments will dictate where you go with it, but you really only have so much control over it at this point, and I'm often surprised. I often get a different result than what I'm shooting for as far as the overtones are concerned at this point. And without getting too deep into it, after the neck is attached and the guitar is fully assembled, there are ways to tweak this further still, and being able to listen to the guitar while you're tweaking it makes it a more controllable process. But really at this point, you're just trying to create a little bit of separation between the notes. Now, I don't have a good enough ear to actually hear and to say that's a 4th or that's a 5th necessarily, like, spot on, but there's a pleasing sense of the sound when you get close to a 4th and a 5th. So don't take too much stock into that. Just recognize that when you hear that really kind of nice separation between the sounds, it's probably a 4th or a 5th, or close to it. Remember, this is like a drum sound we're listening to at this point, so you're not looking for some perfectly tuned pitch. And just to be clear, you're really only doing this sort of experimentation on the lower X-brace arms and the 2 tone bars, and maybe a little bit on the finger braces too. But most importantly are those just creating a tiny bit of separation between the X-brace arms and the tone bars, especially the tone bars. And that just adds some overtone color to it. It's very possible and even likely, it's often the case that after the ballparking process, that initial just getting it to a good flex and sustaining tap, after that process, you often already have an interesting mix of overtones when you tap around. So this is really only if you have ballparked it in, but it just doesn't have a lot of coloration or interesting character or separation between the notes. So you want to add that in. I hope that helps, Andrew. I can go further on it if you want. If you want to throw another question out to the forum, if you want to elaborate on certain aspects of that, but I think that's a good jumping off point. And just as one more caveat to this, I wanted to mention, because he asked about the fundamental tone of the guitar. The fundamental response of the guitar is really more a function of the resonant frequency of the air cavity itself and the modal movements of the top, and to some degree the modal movements of the back. And a lot of those are set, in a sense, early on. I mean, the resonant frequency of the air cavity is mostly set by just the dimensions that you've chosen to work with, right? That's going to determine how deep the body is and the shape of the body and the overall volume of that air cavity. That's very important. And of course, since that is done before any sort of tap tuning, that's kind of already foundationally set in stone just based on what plans you're working from or how you've designed the sound box of your guitar. And the next question comes from Michael, and he's asking about the back bracing as he's seen in some of my videos for guitar number 56. And that bracing pattern, if you haven't seen it, is basically a modified lattice bracing, or you might even call it a modified double X bracing. Again, this is the back, not the top. Okay, so his question is, where did you get the inspiration for the back bracing? I've not encountered that previously in any of my reading or video watching. Structurally, I'm confident that it'll do what it's supposed to do, and it's a unique look. Have you used that bracing previously? If so, what influence does it have on sound or tone, if any? Obviously, the top is the primary sound/tone maker, but the rest of the structure imparts a difference too. I'd love to hear it played when it's finished. Okay, so first of all, no, I haven't used this one previously, and I'm also very excited to hear how this is going to affect the end product. Now, I've seen other builders use a lattice bracing pattern, and I'm mostly inspired here just by Irvin Samaji's teachings on the various back bracing methods for bracing the back, and the importance of thinking hard and deeply about these methods for bracing the back. Now, I'm calling this a modified lattice bracing simply because of those transverse braces that connect the lower bout X and the upper bout X. So that's makes it a little bit different from just a true lattice bracing. And the only reason I do it that way is because I wanted less connections going into sides. So less brace ends being tucked into the sides. I thought with a true lattice bracing, it just seemed like too many connections going into the sides, and it just seemed like that would make it impossibly stiff. At least with the height and thickness of stock that I plan on using for the braces. And so rather than just connecting these four ends of the lattice bracing that I did, I added a little bit more stiffness by coupling some of those ends together with those transverse braces. But in essence, the idea is for this to function like lattice bracing. My hope is that it will allow more of a monopole action of the back plate than you get from your typical ladder bracing, which promotes more long dipole action. By the way, a basic way of understanding the difference between these modal movements of the top is the monopole action is basically a uniform pumping of the plate. So imagine the whole plate, kind of like the subwoofer on a speaker, all moving in unison together. Whereas a long dipole action essentially means that the upper bout and the lower bout are kind of seesawing back and forth. So when the upper bout goes in, the lower bout comes out, and vice versa. Get teeter-tottering. Cross dipole, by the way, is the same thing, but treble side, bass side, teeter-tottering. And that's the sort of thing you get from fan bracing or something like that. The reason ladder bracing promotes long dipole action is because there's no connection or coupling between any of those ladder braces to each other. They're just coupled in with the sides, which creates a very stiff cross dipole, but a very loose long dipole. It's able to move in that direction, and it's going to follow the path of least resistance, so that's what it does. Now, if you look at lattice bracing or double X bracing, you can see that it's reinforced in a more uniform way, whether you're looking at it long dipole direction or the cross dipole direction. And when you cut out the long dipole and the cross dipole, the top is, or the back in this case, is forced to move more in a monopole action. Now, this is a simplified understanding. In any system of plate dynamics, you're going to have a mixture of all of these actions or modal movement. So what I'm really trying to do is just bring out more of the monopole, which gives you more of a base response. Of course, as Michael alluded to, the top is more important than the back, but the back is important to a degree because the top is basically going to pump the air that's in the air cavity, and that's going to affect the back, getting the back in motion as well. And then the top and the back sort of play off of each other. So the back has some influence there. The reason ladder bracing is very popular is not because makers are necessarily trying to bring out that long dipole action. It's really just that it's far easier to execute, and it's become sort of a traditional mainstay, that ladder bracing. In contrast, lattice bracing is more labor intensive. So it takes a little bit more work to do this modified lattice bracing because they have to do several lap joints, but I think it's going to be worth it if it brings out just a little bit more of that monopole and hence base response. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to say today. If you have a question for a future Q&A episode, there are 2 places you can leave those. Number 1, the best place is the members forum if you're a member of the online guitar building school. If you're not a member, you can just place them in the YouTube comments. Anyway, thanks for listening. Bye for now. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video every Friday. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.